to understand passages of Scripture, and even to understand aspects of our faith, one of the most important things to grasp would be the story behind the story, the larger story that the passages come from. So, if you're going to understand what we heard in our first reading from Isaiah chapter 56, the very beginning of 56, it's important to understand that this is the beginning of the conclusion of that entire book of Isaiah. These last 10 chapters, 56 to 66, is a summary, a summation, a restating, and a wrapping up of everything that the prophet Isaiah had been about. And in so doing, it begins this incredible, beautiful image of what God is going to do. This great plan, this profound vision for what is to come. And so we hear two things in the first reading. This call and challenge to justice, and the idea that God's plan for his future relationship with this world is that all people, regardless of where they come from, all people will find welcome and a place to worship in his holy temple. It's this great image of a world renewed and united in worship of him. If you're going to understand Matthew chapter 15, particularly this really harsh gospel passage, because if you were listening, Jesus really is kind of off character today. Here's this woman begging for help for her daughter. And Jesus calls her a dog. And, you know, we sometimes hear that said today, but back then, it was far more insulting than it is today, because today dogs are kind of like cute and fluffy and friendly. That wasn't the case back then. If you're going to understand what's going on, you've got to get the full story of chapter 15. So chapter 15 of Matthew begins with Jesus leaving the Jewish part of the countryside, going across the Sea of Galilee to the Gentile part of the country, called the Decapolis, where there were these villages and small cities of people who were not Jewish, Canaanite or Gentile. And so he very deliberately goes to a community, goes to people that are not his own. This is where you see the exorcism of the man who was possessed by a legion of demons. This is as they're crossing the Sea of Galilee. This is Jesus walking on water. And once Jesus gets there, the leaders of the temple in Jerusalem find out that he has gone to the non-Jewish neighborhood. And they get up, they themselves get up, and they cross the countryside, and they go and rebuke him. They find him in this neighborhood, and they're criticizing him. Why are you not following the traditions of the elders? Why have you brought your message, your proclamation of the kingdom? Why are you working miracles? Why are you doing these good things for our enemies, for people who are not part of our community? Why would you do this? And that's the context for what we hear today. See if you can imagine the picture. Here Jesus is in the house. The religious leaders from Jerusalem are there with him, criticizing him. And this non-Jewish woman comes and begs for a miracle, begs for mercy for her daughter. Can you hear how Jesus speaking to her, he's not using his own words. He's putting into action the prejudice, the bias, the hateful rhetoric of those religious leaders, the hypocrites and the self-righteous from the temple in Jerusalem. They who were just criticizing Jesus, who were belittling and being cruel to people who were not members of the Jewish community, Jesus is putting into practice what it would look like if they were to be honest with her. Can you see how this is playing out? Can you see Jesus bringing to light the things that they were just saying, pointing out and putting into practice those terrible things that they were thinking, as if to embarrass and rebuke them? Because Jesus knew this woman. I'm sure he knew her. I'm sure he knew her heart and knew her faith, and he knew what God was working in her lives, so he knew how this was going to work out. And he used this opportunity to criticize and point out the hypocrisy, the self-righteousness, the prejudice, and the hatred of those who would abandon the vision of Isaiah and allow God's relationship to be simply for us and for the chosen few. You see how that works out? Does that make sense? And so it's important to understand Jesus, in so many of the things that he says and does, he models his ministry off the vision of Isaiah. In so many of the things that he says and does, he is very deliberately opposing all self-righteousness, hypocrisy, and all prejudice that would limit the faith, the grace of God, the mercy of God in God's kingdom to only a select few of the right people. Jesus is deliberately opposing all those agendas that would close off God's kingdom to people other than us. And I'm so grateful that these readings come at the beginning of our year, because I couldn't have imagined a better way of beginning and restating the message that you've heard me say before. You know that the very foundation, the heart and soul of what we are about and what this ministry stands for is to create a space where all are welcome. It doesn't matter who you are, where you come from, what you're thinking, what you're doing. I don't care what you did last night. You're welcome. Now, I need you. I need you, the students, to be actively going out in this community and spreading that message that it doesn't matter who someone is, they're wanted and welcome here. I can't go where you go. I can't contact the people that you contact. I can't share this message with the people that you can. The second thing I think is worth pointing out, that first line from Isaiah, where God calls us to justice. What we are deeply about and deeply committed to is that justice that Isaiah stood for. The justice that looked first and foremost to the needs of the poor and the poor in spirit. First and foremost, to look after those who are put down by the burdens and the pain and the sorrow and the difficulty of this world. Whoever you are, if you find yourself weighed down by difficulty, brokenness, sorrow, shame, guilt, suffering, sickness of any variety, the justice that God calls us to is to prioritize those who suffer in such a way and to care for them above and beyond all other priorities. This is what our faith is about. This is the way that Jesus modeled his message after what Isaiah said. This is why we imitate Jesus and Isaiah in this regard. These are the two pillars that our ministry is built on. The image of caring for and advocating for the needs of those who are poor and poor in spirit, and creating a community where all are welcome. This is what Jesus was all about. This is what we, as we get back into something close to normal, recommit ourselves to. This